Welcome to the English Symposium. This is our 3-minute presentation competition, and we're excited that you're here to support our competitors. Let me introduce our judges. Dr. Jerica Watts and Dr. Aaron Easley are our faculty judges today. And you, all of you in the audience, are also judges. So everyone should have a yellow ballot. Does everyone have a yellow ballot? I should have brought a sample one. Okay. So what you'll be doing with your yellow ballot is, as we watch the presentations, mark your favorite 3. And at the end of the 11 presentations, we'll collect your ballots and we'll tally them while the judges are making their deliberations. So we'll take about a 20 to 30 minute break for the judging and the tallying, and then we will reconvene and announce the winners. And during that time, while the judges are tallying, you can go just across the hall to the table just across the hall and chat with Trina about English Plus opportunities. And there possibly might be some of our English Plus folks who have just recently completed internships that may also be wanting to talk to you. The Audience Choice Award, which you are going to be deciding, is $100. So the competitors are excited to find out the results of your deliberations. So, any questions before we get started? Great. Okay.
This is Owusu. He works at the MTC, he likes Sam Smith music videos, and my 8 a.m. freshman composition class was the first college-level course he ever attended. As both a teacher and a researcher, it's my job to investigate the effectiveness of the education he receives. Particularly, I'm interested in how Owusu, as well as a host of other freshmen, use BYU's incredible academic library. I know that libraries direct people to resources, and I used to think that primarily meant books. Actually, though, the largest budget item at an academic library, like the one we have here on campus, is almost entirely digital. In fact, in 2015, the BYU library spent over $11 million on ongoing resource purchases, which is essentially synonymous with academic articles. To put this number in context, that is nearly 3 times the entire Provo City Library's budget for the same year. So, how do freshmen use these resources, and how has that resource use changed over time? To answer those questions, I compiled research papers spanning just under 2 decades, and I set to work looking solely at the library resources employed in the writing. This could mean books, academic articles, encyclopedias, or even publicly funded research. I tracked how often each resource type was used per paper across over 70 papers, resulting in nearly 1,000 pieces of coded data. And here are the results. I hope you can still hear me. What I found was that books as a resource type have been used less and less since the year 1999. And academic articles, the $11 million a year big budget item, are being used with increasing frequency. And this makes sense, right, to some degree. We're at a university, research is the name of the game, and additionally, the academic articles are crucial to the research that professors do here. But allowing student research writing to lean so heavily and so exclusively on academic research could be poison to those who professionalize outside the reach of an academic library, which is nearly everyone. While graduates will almost undoubtedly have access to a public library, once they leave the university, they cut ties with the academic library and its articles. The cutting-edge research that sets academic libraries apart will be locked out of reach. To illustrate the point, without access to an academic library, I would have had to spend over $2,500 to access the research presented in these 3 minutes alone. Over here, the books, the declining graph, those are the resources that students will primarily have access to once they professionalize, unused. The inclining graph, those are the resources that will be locked away the day students grab their diploma, more popular than ever. So where to from here? This data raises many more questions than it presents tidy solutions. But knowing the trends exist, putting them into tangible data points is the first word in a conversation about how to ensure that students, such as Owusu, don't spend their entire academic careers refining research skills that are non-transferable to professional life.
When Diana Wynne Jones, age 8, told her parents she wanted to become a writer, her mother said, "You don't have it in you." Her father laughed. He thought girls weren't meant to do anything. Despite her parents' reaction, Jones was not deterred. Her future self had leaned back from the years ahead and told her what she was, and there was no stopping destiny. However, her writing career did not take off for some time. She grew up, studied at Oxford, married, and had 3 children. As she read to her children, she discovered inadequacies in the children's literature of the time. Everything seemed trite and moralizing, 2 things that Jones despised. She also noticed the lack of strong females, something she'd picked up on as a child while reading classical mythology about women like Medea and Hero. Jones said, "There seems to have been an overwhelming acceptance that meekness was the lot of a good woman, until she was goaded into turning evil." What did this mean for Jones? It meant that, like her parents thought, she couldn't become a great writer. She couldn't be a hero. Luckily, Jones liked nothing better than breaking rules and manipulating expectations. She, a woman, became a writer and wrote over 40 fantasy novels for children and young adults. Many of these books have female heroes, a rare phenomenon for the genre at that time. This leads us to my research question. How does Jones manipulate the genre of fantasy, adhering to its traditional structures while experimenting with them in order to incorporate young adult female heroes? Fantasy is built upon structures and patterns that readers have been exposed to so much that they feel unconsciously familiar. This foundation of familiarity allows readers to stretch their imaginations and recognize the reality and depth of the secondary world the author creates. In response to my question, I'd like to focus on Jones's manipulation of the monomyth, the ultimate narrative archetype. To give a brief summary, the hero, someone atypical and male, sets out on an adventure, encounters supernatural powers, vanquishes evil, then returns home, somehow changed. Jones's subversion of the hero's journey occurs in varying degrees throughout her novels. The novel I will focus on for the sake of this presentation is called Fire and Hemlock, in which Jones does not merely replace the male of a hero's journey with the female, but creates her own structure from the tradition. Fire and Hemlock is the story of Polly, who has 2 sets of memories, ordinary and extraordinary. Polly uncovers this second set of memories and realizes that her mind has been altered so that she would forget Tom, the man she loves. The novel is built upon the Scottish ballad Tam Lin, in which Janet saves her lover from the Queen of the Fairies, just as Polly saves Tom Lin from Laurel. Jones remarked that Janet behaves throughout the story like a woman and not like a pseudo-man. To make Polly feel like a genuine hero like Janet, Jones didn't think plopping her into a female version of the male hero's journey would suffice. She needed to break from the traditional structure and craft her own. She does this by having 2 characters share the role of hero. Polly and Tom continually swap active and passive roles. In some events, Polly is the hero while Tom is the sidekick. In others, Tom is the hero and Polly the sidekick. Together they, male and female, are both heroes, but they are also both supporting characters, just as we are in real life. Jones has manipulated the structure of fantasy to include girls in heroism, showing that we're all heroes to some degree. I think this is why people turn to Jones's novels when they feel vulnerable. No matter how ordinary you are, you can be heroic.
Who vies for change, and a villain who dares to stand in their way. But in recent media trends, I've noticed something. I've noticed that not only do we sympathize with this hero, but we're also starting to sympathize with the villains of the story and empathize with them. In essence, we are rooting for the bad guy. So for now, I am going to explore why that is. Richard Keene, he wrote a paper called Rooting for the Bad Guy. And in this paper, he outlines 3 main reasons why this may be occurring. Number 1 is our exposure to the villain in the story. Number 2 is the villain's attractiveness to us in the story. And number 3 is the backstory that we receive from this villain. So for today, I'm going to illustrate this point by using Captain Hook as my example, but feel free to plug in any villain into this formula to see if we are rooting for that bad guy. So in 1953, Peter Pan was Disney's animated film that was released. And in this movie, we see Captain Hook in battle with Peter Pan, we see Captain Hook in battle with a crocodile, and we see Captain Hook planning to battle these two. But other than that, we're not really exposed to his character much more. As for his looks, he has these long, luscious black locks, a twisty, curly mustache, and he wears tights. He's not exactly our definition of what would be attractive, nor was he the definition back in 1953, because that wasn't the point. The point wasn't to be attractive, the point was to be the villain. And number 3, his backstory. He doesn't have one. We know he opposes Peter Pan, and we know that he has an aversion to crocodiles with clocks in them. But other than that, we don't know too much more about who he is as a person. Now, fast forward to ABC's television series, Once Upon a Time. In this series, Captain Hook appears in season 2, and from season 2 to the end of the series, he is a main character who is influencing plot arcs, character arcs, and he develops on his own. As for his looks, he gets a major revamp. Gone are the creepy tights, and now we have an attractive man who looks like a dastardly pirate, can pull off guy liner, and speaks with a British accent, which most Americans find more appealing. And number 3, his backstory. He's no longer just Captain Hook, a man with a hook, but he is Killian Jones, a man with a past, a family, and trials that he has to work through throughout the series. Now, Captain Hook goes from the villain of the story, and by the end of the series, he becomes one of the heroes, signaling to us a redemption of the villain of the story. I believe this is the reason why we've started to root for the bad guy. It's because these villains can be doing the most horrible things, and yet throughout their character development, they can turn into the heroes of their own stories. So for us, that is a beacon of hope that we can transform ourselves from being the villain in our stories to becoming the heroes of our own stories. Thank you.
Observation that we live in a world of hyperrealities, or simulations, copies and copies of an original until the original is lost. Now, these hyperrealities are places that we turn to that we believe are better than our own reality. Now, this could be the Netflix show that we watch, any video game, or any type of social media. Now, the Wachowski siblings once made a movie based on this very concept, and they called it The Matrix. And the idea for this movie first came to Lana Wachowski's mind when she was pondering over the question, what if this world is the virtual world? And thus The Matrix was born. In the movie, the protagonist, Neo, comes to find out that his reality is in fact a virtual reality, created by artificial intelligences who are set on making sure the human race does not find out and fight back and gain control over the real world. Now Neo, once he discovers this, sets out to right this wrong. So the point of this movie, we should all be like Neo and fight back against the simulations of this world in order to get back to what is real. And this is an idea that Baudrillard endorses. And even though Baudrillard and the Wachowskis make correct observations of our world, we do in fact live in a world of simulations, they have a major flaw in their solution. Instead of fixing simulations by stripping them away, we need to instead focus on how we can use them for good. Unfortunately, media today largely echoes Baudrillard and the Wachowski siblings' belief. They all come to the same conclusion: social media, it's bad. Virtual reality, don't go there. And robots, well, they're going to take over the world. Well, I make the observation that all virtual realities do not inevitably lead to a diminished life. In fact, they can enhance our lives. For example, teachers are incorporating virtual reality technologies in their classroom to enhance learning. Military and law enforcement are using simulations to help with training. Therapists and psychiatrists are also using virtual reality technologies to help people who struggle with mental illnesses such as PTSD, depression, and anxiety disorders. Artificial intelligence technologies are revolutionizing the medical field, and studies even show that kids who participate in video games can develop positive attributes such as teamwork and trust. So the solution to our increased hyper-real world around us cannot and should not be to just get rid of simulations. Instead, we need to focus our attention on how we can use them for good. Because this is our world today, and it's going to continue to be this way. And if our only solution is to destroy the simulations around us, we will be failing to take control of opportunities around us for progress and growth that are just within our reach. Thank you.
Classroom when the teacher announced that the next unit of study would be Shakespeare. As a future English teacher myself, this is a problem that I'm undoubtedly going to have to deal with. So you can imagine my excitement when I realized that Shakespeare wrestles with these issues in some of his own writings. By combining his stories with my experiences and a great deal of research, I've developed 3 steps: a pre, a during, and a post-reading strategy that I believe will help students tolerate Shakespeare and maybe even learn a little bit from him. The first step is conceptualization. When I was first introduced to Shakespeare in high school via Romeo and Juliet, I hated him. I really struggled with it. And I think that if I had been introduced to Shakespeare through a different medium first, before I jumped straight into the text, then my experience would have been different. Just like kids need to warm up before gym class, they need to warm up for Shakespeare. And we have so many tools accessible to us that we can help students do this. We have YouTube, we have modernized interpretations and translations of the text. We even have photographs of past performances. And by using these tools to help students conceptualize the text first, then when they actually get into the text, it won't be so foreign. Now the second step is an extension of the reading experience. Shakespeare actually talks about this a lot in his plays, but my personal favorite comes from his play Love's Labour's Lost. In this play, 4 men vow to do nothing but study for 3 years. In order to help them accomplish this, they make a pact with each other that none of them will date. And when they all inevitably fall in love with some visiting ladies, they come up with hilarious arguments to try and get out of this oath that they've made. You see, they say, it doesn't do us much good to learn about beauty and excellence from books when we could learn so much more by looking into the eyes of our loves. Yeah, it's cheesy, and it's obviously motivated by romance, but they kind of have a point. You have to step outside just reading in order to have an authentic learning experience. Now the last step is connection. Recently I had the opportunity to work in a 9th grade English class. They were studying a unit on mythology, and one of the students, who usually sloughed class and was very bored with English in general, was super intrigued by this unit. And it wasn't until I graded her reading response that I realized why. In her reading response, she wrote that one of the myths she had studied in class had actually influenced a decision that she made in her personal life with her friends. And that is so cool. All of a sudden she connected with the theme, with the text, with the character, with the story. And with that connection, and with her realization of that connection, that story became, in a way, hers. One of the characters in Love's Labour's Lost says, "Learning is but an adjunct to ourself, and where we are, our learning likewise is." When teachers use these 3 steps to take the Shakespeare education experience to where students truly are, then those students will be able to see the value in Shakespeare even after they take their final exam. Thank you.
The viral Me Too movement has fostered or begun to foster a society in which narratives of female sexual assault are finally believed when presented by women. However, if you scroll through the comments section on any news source, you'll find a group of individuals, mainly men, who put the blame on the female victim instead of on her male perpetrator. This system of critiquing the female narrative and not believing it, trying to change it and place the blame on the woman for her sexual assault has, not surprisingly, been around since practically forever. One of the places I found this particularly telling was in the female criminal narratives of Puritan New England. Now, the female criminal narratives focused on the infanticidal woman, a woman whose only crime really was that she didn't have a midwife present at her birth to determine whether or not she delivered a stillbirth, a live baby, or it was a miscarriage. Now, these women were lower class, non-white, single, and often slaves or indentured servants. Their low status in society made it impossible for them to have a midwife present, report the birth or the pregnancy, and to report the sexual assault, mainly because those who were the father of their children and presumably the male perpetrators of the sexual assault were also their masters, their employers, or their non-familial guardians. Yet it is plausible to believe that these women did report their assault to trusted members of the community, namely the clergymen who were responsible for transcribing, editing, and publishing their criminal narratives after their death. However, much like purity culture today, the men in positions of power at that time twisted the words of the women, enshrouding the sexual assault with religious explanations in order to make an example of the women, to place the blame on them for their assault rather than being unfortunate victims of circumstance. So these women fell prey to the pens and the greed of these clergymen, making it virtually impossible to say, like, hey, this actually happened to me. This was the reason for, the infanticide charge. So there is very significant language in these narratives that makes it very, very obvious that these women were most likely sexually assaulted. One woman had her chastity attempted 3 times before the man finally seduced her, yet Cotton Mather, famous for the Salem witch trials, said it was because she fell away from God. Now, it's really hard to determine the accuracy of these documents because we have the male imposing his voice on the female's narrative. Yet, we must preserve and glean what we can of the true voice behind the sensationalized literature, because every woman truly deserves to be heard.
Do you remember what you were doing October 27th of this past year? If you were anything like me, you were binge watching the newest season of Stranger Things into the early hours of the morning. And according to Variety.com, I wasn't alone. 15.8 million viewers watched the first episode of the new season within 3 days of its release. As I analyzed the characteristics of that contributed to this success, I made a connection with successful American author Edgar Allan Poe. Remarkably, the way that the Duffer Brothers, creators of Stranger Things, and Edgar Allan Poe approach genre and storytelling is very similar. Their selection of genre is especially similar. Unfortunately for Poe, he was in very poor circumstances for most of his life, and this made it very important for him that his work sold. As a result, he wrote tales such as Metzengerstein and in the Gothic genre. This genre was not only incredibly popular in the United States, but it also gave his name international recognition. Similarly, Stranger Things is grounded in 1980s science fiction. It has been compared to Tron, E.T., Ghostbusters, and has references to Dungeons and Dragons as well. This makes the genre chock full of nostalgia, and if we need any further evidence of the popularity of nostalgia today, we need to only look at the Disney Empire. Not only was their selection of genre similar, but their application of the genre was similar as well. In addition to writing in the Gothic genre, Poe implemented elements of science fiction as well. He did this through using scientific, technical language that gave an explanation to the fantastical and surreal events that occurred in his works. Stranger Things does this as well. Through the scientific explanation, they give a theory for how dimensions could cross. And although this hasn't fooled anyone into thinking that Demogorgons roam Indiana, it allows the audience to suspend their disbelief enough to invest in the story, which is what the appeal of science fiction is all about. Their implementation of suspense and horror is also similar. Edgar Allan Poe was one of the first to implement psychological horror from the perspective of the character experiencing the madness himself. We can see this in tales such as The Telltale Heart, The Raven, and Berenice. Stranger Things also does this similarly, especially in the second season when one of the characters is possessed by a dark force. We get glimpses into the character's mind throughout the season, which builds suspense, horror, and thrill, and also an appeal to audience. Through these implementation of these characteristics, Poe's works have stood the test of time. Will it do the same for Stranger Things? Only time will tell. Thank you.
Most people who've spent any amount of time studying Flannery O'Connor and her works can tell you she was a devout Catholic. It shows in her writing, and it especially shines in her penchant for delivering grace to her characters in violent and shocking ways. But because of her religious background, we run the risk of getting stuck in a critical rut, and forgetting that a piece of writing can be interpreted in more than one way. I've found, for instance, through my studies, that it's in fact not only possible, but actually quite easy to interpret her works through an LDS lens as well. First of all, if we look at Catholicism and Mormonism, we can see plenty of differences, naturally. These differences range from such small things as the age and importance of a priesthood office to the fundamental constitution of the Godhead. But for as many differences between the two religions as there are plenty of similarities as well. One thing in particular is the importance of grace in both churches. Now, grace, loosely defined, is the power Jesus Christ has to save us from sin and death. And in both churches, it's known as the whole reason any of us have a chance at heaven and at getting out of hell. In O'Connor's works, grace tends to come close to a character's death, if not with it. It is violent and painful and life-changing. For instance, in A Good Man is Hard to Find, both the grandmother and the criminal known as the misfit received their moment of grace through the grandmother's death by gunshot. In Parker's Back, Parker receives his moment of grace through a series of culminating moments of increasing violence, which come to a head in his receiving a beating across his freshly tattooed back, upon which he has gotten an attention-commanding image of a Byzantine Christ. These moments of grace are painful and can actually seem pretty cruel from a Mormon standpoint. I know I thought that way to begin with. The LDS Church focuses so much on the power of forgiveness and of repentance and the doctrine of a loving God. But I'd like to remind you all of one thing in particular that I'm sure every member of the church will remember learning in Sunday school at one point or another: the pride cycle. Is it not possible that when, say, the Nephites become too prideful and wicked and need a good reminder of what they're doing wrong, that God gives them grace through the trials that humble them? When they get particularly wicked, the Nephites tend to lose battles and wars. In short, and not unlike the characters of O'Connor's stories, the most and worst violence comes to them when they need reminding of who their God is. And this echoes very clearly the sentiments of O'Connor, given that she found violence to be strangely capable of returning her characters to reality and preparing them to accept their moment of grace. As she said, their heads are so hard that almost nothing else will do the work. So, yes, O'Connor's works don't just have to be funneled through a Catholic interpretation. There's a ton of value in being able to interpret her stories and their messages through other lenses too, including, and maybe especially, a Mormon one. Thank you.
Muskogee is located on the MK&T Railroad 7 or 8 miles south of the Arkansas River on a high rolling prairie. To be found at this place are the International Fairgrounds, where the 5 tribes meet annually to exhibit their stock and other products. And in many cases, the white man may profit by being present and taking advantage of the example set by the Indian. End of quote. In relatively recent history, we have seen a shift in the American literary canon to include marginalized and forgotten voices, and this is an incredibly important move. Native Americans, African Americans, and women are just some of the groups being brought in to offer a broader scope of the American experience. However, more work does need to be done, and this is something that we might not be aware of. After having the opportunity to work with 2 Native American newspapers, a clear gap became apparent to me. When studying Native text, orators such as Chief Blackhawk and Red Jacket take center stage. They offer moving pieces that decry the white man's treatment of their peoples, and rightfully so. Native Americans were subject to unspeakable horrors and were at times forced to assimilate to American culture against their will. But these are the extremes, and this largely ignores the daily realities of many large Native American communities. And this became evident through the study of these 2 Native American newspapers, the Daily Indian Journal and the Mental Elevator. And one piece that originated from the Daily Indian Journal is Muskogee as a Stranger Sees It. And this piece highlights that there were some communities that became somewhat traditionally American. This town is a lot like many others you would see in the 1800s. They have a thriving local economy that relies heavily on cattle stock, 2 Christian churches, and a school where children may receive an education. And other primary sources found in these newspapers support this wider view. But before beginning my work with these newspapers, I and many of my peers also involved in the project were completely unaware that communities like Muskogee even existed. The impression is often given that only a few prominent people were writing at the time of Native American groups, and no other writing was being done, and this is simply untrue. In criticism, there appears to be little to no exploration of works such as these. This gap must be bridged, and we must include different Native American experiences into the critical conversation. By no means does this suggest that the injustices done against Native Americans were any less widespread or heinous than they were. But by omitting any voice from the time period, the conversation cannot be considered a complete one, and the cycle simply continues to perpetuate. And this is the problem with the way that the canon sees Muskogee. It doesn't. Thank you.
Published in 1975 during the midst of the bloody Irish Troubles, Seamus Heaney released North, a poetry collection that many consider the quintessence of his early work. Despite the wide-ranging critical dissonance surrounding the volume, there's a stunning silence of scholarly commentary on the namesake collection, the poem that is the namesake of the collection, which is North. Often ignored by critics, it is an afterthought. Critics miss how this poem not only shapes the collection, but offers a lens through which we can view ourselves and our culture. Heaney's poem takes place on a dark, icy, unforgiving terrain that is set ablaze by the conquering fire of its ancient inhabitants, the Vikings. He uses this realm as a forum to explore the thematic elements of light and dark. He discovers their simultaneously oppositional yet symbiotic relationship. So, how do these 2 opponents become allies? Let me explain. Heaney uses paradox to first explore the seemingly cantankerous relationship between the 2 opponents. He's careful to keep these Iron Age conquerors at an arm's length by repeatedly referring to them as a separate outgroup, which establishes a glass wall between us and them. This allows us objectivity to judge the sunlight and shadows of their culture. Heaney later then invites us to use the same standard of judgment on ourselves and our culture. Because when Heaney is talking about light and dark, he's also talking about civility and barbarism. After all, how can an empire establish an amazingly expansive trade route, excellent folklore, exemplary art, yet be so drenched in blood? The question becomes more than just how do light and dark coexist to how can a society seem so civil, yet be barbaric? Heaney attempts to answer this question by turning the relationship of these opponents on its head. He argues, one cannot understand the light without composing in darkness first, and darkness needs light to define its bounds. Similarly, often civil endeavors require the strong-armed threat of barbarism to back their success. Their relationship is not about enmity. It's about amicability. Light and dark, civility and barbarism are two sides of the same coin featured here. And humanity in its fullness cannot exist without both of them. In the end, North does more than just shape the collection that it titles. It asks us questions about who we are and who we want to be. If some civil things are actually barbaric, and some barbaric things are actually civil, where do we draw the line between light and dark? Because where we draw that line not only defines who we are, but who we will become. Thank you.
Okay. As kids, we view our parents as superheroes. Especially in relation to our fathers, we see them as guys who can fix everything from a broken door, a broken pipe, to broken hearts and shattered confidence. Sometimes in fatherhood, we see them as flawless. We see them as invincible when we were kids. But as we grow up, we see that we end up seeing our fathers as humans. In my experience with my father, I've seen that. I've seen times when my dad has lost his superhero cape, but I love him just the same. In our society, we see a lot of people argue that fathers are developmentally dispensable, that they're not necessary anymore. And some people even go to the point of disowning or even completely denying their fathers. This is the case in Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. With Okonkwo, the main character, and his son, we can see this relationship. When asked about his son, when asked about his father, Nwoye, Okonkwo's son, says, "I don't know, he is not my father." Many critics of the book agree that Okonkwo's actions justify Nwoye's denial of Okonkwo as a father. One such critic, Nwando Achebe, the daughter of Chinua Achebe, agrees that Okonkwo exhibits the characteristics that are historically and culturally abhorred by the Igbo tribe of which he is a part. And although he does exemplify those traits, and he does have a very fiery and short temper, he in reality is building upon the father that he had. We can't understand Okonkwo clearly enough without looking at his father Unoka. Unoka was a man who was known throughout the tribe as being lazy, improvident, always in debt, and most especially incapable of planting and producing yams. And on the other hand, Okonkwo was a leader in the tribe. He was someone who had many wives, which was a sign of authority. He was able to provide for his family. Okonkwo, in this respect, is improving upon the fatherhood that he saw in his dad. In comparison to the stereotypical fathers of the 1950s when the book was published, we can see that these men also, these men had similar struggles. They were displaced from fatherhood, and they had to redefine what fathers were. And instead of these men, because of these struggles of having to redefine fatherhood, they were left angry and quick-tempered like Okonkwo. Rather than looking at the flaws of fathers in our society and also in literature, we can learn how to see our fathers as not the bad guy, but pretty super guys. Thank you.